All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, GenAI Governance Strategies from QFCRA. So QFCRA is the Qatar Financial Center Regulatory Authority, and we'll be hearing from a few of them shortly on how they're handling GenAI governance. So the first thing we're going to do today is introduce the speakers, and then I will do a quick introduction to GenAI and Knime before we move on to a few presentations and demos from QFCRA and the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, let's introduce our speakers today. We have Perttu Korhonen, Head of Financial Analysis and Innovation at QFCRA, and Tosin Adekanye, Data Scientist at QFCRA. So if you two want to say hello, we'll get the webinar moving.
Hi, Corey. Thanks.
All right. We'll see you guys back here shortly. So first things first, I want to give you a little bit of a background on what GenAI means at Knime and how we see it inside of our own ecosystem. First thing I want to talk about here is just to drop a few statistics from a recent Cisco data privacy study. So we see that 79% of organizations perceive significant value from GenAI adoption, while 27% have an outright ban on its usage. And really, this is just here to motivate the difficulty around this topic. Most of us agree that there's significant value to be gained from using GenAI, but also that there are significant risks. So really, if we want to extract value, we have to learn how to handle those risks. And that is where the topic of governance comes into play. Some of the opportunities that come up with GenAI are, this massive impact on mundane tasks. We see ourselves using it as a replacement for Google. Maybe we see ourselves using it to summarize long emails or user manuals or blogs. And its application space is really incredibly broad. We see value from the implementation of AI in almost every vertical, in almost every job, where we can really bring it and use it. But there's a lot of risks and problems that come with using it, legally with copyright issues, ethically, practically even with fake outcomes and hallucinations, and financially with things like skyrocketing consumption costs. If we really start using this all day, every day, it can get expensive. So those are kind of the topics we want to discuss today. And if AI can't be trusted, what can we do? So Knime sees GenAI in our ecosystem in really three different ways. First, assist and explain. So this is where we'll be able to use AI to help workflow builders, to teach data science skills, to kind of ask questions natively as an improved search. Using customize, where we can kind of augment our existing analytics. So think of that as augmenting workflows. We can bake AI into our existing workflows and use it to augment existing processes. And we can also augment AI with analytics. So think prompt engineering or passing more specific information to these AIs before we ask them their questions. And then finally, on the governing topic, where we'll talk about how to safeguard AI usage and protect our data in that way. This top block is where we see Knime Analytics platform being relevant. This is where you'll be able to do these things like conversational searches for nodes, assisting in code configurations with Python and eCharts, as well as augmenting your existing models with some of the nodes that I'm going to show you in a moment here. This is where you'll be able to connect to things like OpenAI, Hugging Face, and other suppliers of these AI models. The first place you'll probably see AI in Knime Analytics platform is the new Knime AI Assistant. So this is an extension that you'll need to install. But once you have it installed, you'll have this extra block on the left side of your screen where you can talk with Kai. Kai is going to be able to do conversational searches. So you can type in there and say, what node can I use to read in an Excel file, for example? And you'll get a response back, some nodes suggested, and you'll even be able to drag and drop those nodes straight from the chat window. The other place that you'll see this AI assistant is in the Python and eCharts code editors, where you'll be able to use code completion and do things like ask Kai to create a funnel chart for you, and it will inject the code straight into that script for you. If you want to use and customize your workflows with AI, we have the AI extension here, where you can see we have a lot of different connectors for these different hosts, as well as ways to create vector stores, AI agents, and chat models that will have this recursive feedback. one example of a workflow where you might be embedding AI into your regular analysis is if you're doing something like web scraping. Here's an example where we connect to OpenAI, we grab an LLM from there, and we use it to help us analyze and report on some web scraped data. So we'll get into more specifics, but just to show you how it can be baked into a workflow. The other half of that conversation is how we will help with managing and governing the usage of these models. And that's going to be through the Knime Business Hub. And we kind of see that in a few different ways. The first one is that we'll be able to whitelist AI models that different teams possibly on the hub are able to access, as well as set up security layers through what we're going to call gateways. Now, the first thing you'll see once you go to your AI models page on the Business Hub is this consumption dashboard. So this is going to help you understand how much you're spending on AI, which teams are consuming the most AI, and which models are being used. Now, when you're using this from a practical level, you'll be able to use this Knime Hub connector for the Knime Hub chat model connector. And when you're using this, the AP user will be able to select some of the whitelist models, and those models will have this security gateway that you can set up and customize in the form of a workflow. So in this case, you see some data coming in. It is being anonymized with some of our anonymization tools before being passed to the prompter and returned. So you can do this so that there's no way for a AP user to pass sensitive data to the external AI because it is first being anonymized before leaving your ecosystem. This is one way we're enabling you to kind of own your own security around this governance topic with AI models. The other half of that is the removal, of course, of the native OpenAI connectors and restricting usage to the Hub Chat model connector if you want to fully safeguard against AI usage like that. Okay, so what we really see Knime being able to do here is drive up GenAI adoption. We can bring it to really a great number of people here. The AP is unlicensed. You can install it on as many desktops as you need and deploy to thousands of end users. And that's with AP. With Knime Business Hub, we really want to drive down the GenAI risk, where we're creating this transparent security gateway in the form of these workflows that are fully editable by you, as well as giving you these ways to view consumption metrics and deploy your GenAI solutions at scale with the Business Hub. So with that brief introduction to where AI lives at Knime, I want to pass over to our first speaker, and we'll talk a little bit about how QFCRA is doing GenAI governance.
Excellent. Thank you, Corey. Thanks very much for that introduction. And as you said, this is very much an evolving field. So I'm very keen to make this interactive. So this presentation represents our current thinking of what we think we want to do, but by no means challenge, ask questions. This is something where we don't really have examples yet or gold standard in place. So let's get started. So just a little bit of financial supervision. You might be aware of financial sector being supervised. So we have central banks, we have regulators that have the mandate of ensuring that the financial institutions that hold our money as depositors, as investors, that they are behaving prudently around using our funds in investing them further in loans and other assets. Also, we saw in 2008, especially when multiple firms get into trouble at the same time, the whole system might be at the brink of collapse. And again, this is something where ultimately the normal members of public can be the ones suffering the most. All of a sudden, there's no payment systems, cash machines working. You might have money somewhere in theory, but you just can't get it out of the bank. So these are the reasons why it's very important that we do closely regulate and supervise those firms that provide services around finance. How we do this? This is a combination of on-site and off-site operations. We mostly now in this presentation, we are in the realm of off-site, and this is about collecting data from the financial players and then using that in combination to external statistics, macroprudential data, news articles, all kinds of information we can just get hold of in assessing the riskiness and the direction of the financial sector and the individual players there. These insights then turn into regular reports, which are consumed internally, and then feed into the process of planning for on-site visits, in which then supervisors go into these firms physically and meet people, inspect processes, inspect documents, and so on. And then what follows from this is risk assessment that then updates or refreshes our view of the risk and the how it's managed in these institutions. And this is very much a cyclical, ongoing process where all these parts feed information between each other. So in the past few years, a new term has emerged alongside fintech. As we all know, fintech means providing or developing financial services by using technology. Then a little bit less known and definitely an area where less money is involved is RegTech, which is about then regulatory technology, which is about the financial firms using technology in order to comply with the regulatory rules in the most streamlined and affordable way. And then thirdly, the SupTech, which is supervisory technology, is about using these technology for the purposes of supervisors to better stay abreast of what is happening. And where we are, and this is very much now my personal view, how it's evolving currently, is that we are now passing the phase of creating individual products. In many fields, there was years of prototyping, proof of concepts, and a lot of that was done to ensure buy-in from our senior leaders who might not have been of the generation and ability to really be convinced of the potential of technology until they see it in practice. But now largely this time is over, and the buy-in is there, and everyone accepts and agrees and knows that great things can be achieved. Now it's more about turning everything into production. And just like in fintech, where we actually don't talk about fintech, we don't refer to individual tools, but rather a business model. An old bank creating very sophisticated model for credit assessments doesn't make it a fintech. They might still have very clunky processes around that model. There might be people who need to feed in something manually as parameters to the model and then take an Excel spreadsheet out of the model as a result and feed that data into another system. So that, of course, is still very, very heavily 90s. Whereas fintechs are companies that have from the start, they are data first companies, and they ensure that they have a platform where all the modules speak to each other, and the whole business model is really built on that. Now, interestingly, GenAI, large language models, is showing a lot of potential in acting like a glue, because a lot of this is about data integration. Of course, as long as you are talking about your internal data sets, you should always ensure that your schemas in different databases speak to each other so that you can extract exact insights out of your databases. But increasingly in every field, the information we need is also in the space of publicly available data or data we subscribe to, in which the schema is not in our control. which means that we have to somehow integrate these data sets because they are also getting bigger and bigger by the day. And the LLMs are showing very good potential now also in extracting structure and finding these linkages and helping us to integrate the data. So, and the end game we are aiming at then could look something like this. We have internal and external information sources. Then we have a system we are developing at the moment, Master Data Management System, MDM, which, by the way, is Knime Hub-based, Knime Hub orchestrated platform, in which we use machine learning and AI to integrate data and use users as human in the loop to advise in tricky cases in order to make all the data sets to align nicely before the downward supervisory analytics. Then what we call the MLAI, then that includes everything else, all the models, all the analytics that is then based on this integrated data. And this can include forecasting models for economy. It can include classification algorithms for bank failure. It can include LLM aids where the supervisor drafts analytical reports based on data and using the supervisor's input to get where the supervisor wants to get. And then importantly, all of this interaction needs to be saved back into the database. So we want to completely avoid these manual breakpoints and Excel spreadsheets being inputs or outputs into the internal processes. So one example of this is AML, anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing tool in which we are using LLMs now to analyze compliance. So this is quite similar to many legal applications of LLMs where we see people taking a rule book or a set of laws on the one hand, and then some evidence from elsewhere on the other, and then asking the LLM to analyze the differences. So in this case, we have rule book by us, and then we have policies and procedures document by the firms we supervise, in which they have to justify that they meet all the principles and they have all those elements in place in terms of governance, certain individuals with certain backgrounds and the certain management bodies in place in order to ensure that they manage the money laundering risk appropriately. So LLM is really powerful then in assessing, making these comparisons. So we have fed into the system around 20 prompts that are analytical questions, and Tosin is the one building the system, so she will be happy to answer questions around this as well. So these defined prompts define the analysis, and then the supervisor is then able to assess each piece of judgment by the LLM model. And the model, by the way, so it does refer to the underlying documents as well. So it's able to tell you that on the page 17, third paragraph, the firm says so and so. So you can then always go back and ensure that you accept what the LLM has extracted from the documents. And then in the end, there's space or drop-down menu for the supervisor to decide whether by this aspect I agree or whether this is compliant or not, and then write their own justification, which again is already quite important governance aspect, that we will never be taking the AI suggestions as they are, but we ensure that the users understand that these are only suggestions and these are coming from an AI model, and you still need to think and put in your own opinion, and that will be connected to you, not to the AI in the system. So all in all, as Corey mentioned as well, LLMs are not to be trusted. We mostly see them as vehicles for knowledge and reasoning, not something we can trust in either of these regards. So the various roles, Corey went through these as well. So we also see that there's multiple different uses for LLMs in our domain. But definitely there are issues when we are talking about high stake public policy making. And you could say any company will need to be very careful when assessing LLM, integrating LLMs to any of business processes. So one obvious challenge is that at the moment the leading models are all closed source, so very little knowledge is there about how they actually work. One particular example of this is the architecture GPT-4 possibly has. I think there was last year when the model came out, the internet analysts quickly concluded, without OpenAI making any publications regarding this itself, pretty quickly the audience was quite certain that this is, I think it was 13 expert model mixture. So essentially any question a user asks, first of all, the model will look, the system will look in which domain this question mostly relates to. Is this about finance or sports, or what is it about? And then there's a model that has been basically a GPT 3.5 model that has been then specifically trained to answer questions within this domain. And this, of course, can create unexpected outcomes, or that we don't know where that tipping point is, that one model is more dominant in the answer than another. And sometimes maybe our questions and the discussion falls in between two models. And when we, just like with human beings, the risk in here is that we will, with LLMs, them being so human-like, we will start expecting them to be somehow consistent. But the mixture of experts model architecture means that they can always come up with surprises when suddenly another model is more dominant in the answer. And the same goes to the reinforcement learning by human feedback. So this essentially is a sanitation mechanism. And of course, it's also a big part of the user experience. So why ChatGPT became so popular was the user experience. And a lot of it is, of course, this. So OpenAI had a lot of people labeling answers by the model based on how desirable those answers were. And this is also the way all the toxic talk was cleaned from the system. No one went to explicitly tell it that I'm just a language model, I can't go into these politics, but it gradually learned this through the feedback when people were placing two possible answers into order. And this again, while mostly probably everyone can agree about those outputs and the outcome, that these are just generally humanly good decisions, but then at the same time, it's completely opaque to us, and we don't know whether, from what perspective, what is that does this training really align with our culture and our objectives, and we just simply don't know. And in the extreme, you can even say that one person's fact is another person's bias. There's a lot of nationalist talk now in the most civilized countries, and it would be very hard to arrive at a uniform, universal idea of what are the facts. And therefore, of course, it's it is a worry that when you use a model that is based on data you don't exactly know, based on training you don't exactly know that whether this is going to help you to meet your objectives. And related to the specific domain of supervision also, we are quite a niche domain, and especially then it can be expected that the LLM can quite quickly be out of its depth in terms of how much similar talk it has seen in its training data. And this can even impact the RAG setup. So there was some research I saw recently that when the domain of use is very different from the training data, the RAG approach can actually create quite a lot of hallucination still. And in our case, we are a niche domain, and therefore this is something to look out for as well. The risks here, basically, we can divide them into exactly the same risks as any analytics system, any model-based system. We have risks related to the models, like we have just discussed, how they are developed, trained, how reliable, consistent they are. We have risks relating to data, how is it collected, stored, and managed. We have risks relating to the broader technology platform, including third-party risks and open source component risks. We have risks relating to misuse, either intentional or unintentional, and including attacks to our system as well. We have legal and compliance risks. So then here, of course, we have the privacy, we have copyright risk. And then what we are aiming to do here is a digital transformation of the supervisory process, and this will need to happen in many fields, in any knowledge field. Once now these platforms become possible, the whole operational model will change, and that can itself bring risks that need to be managed, that when things are done differently and in different order and with different responsibilities. So we do need to consider those as well. So how we are thinking of approaching this is that we need to set up our AI governance and document it and socialize it well. We have to expand our thinking and management of operational risks to risks that are specific to AI applications. We need to define the roles and responsibilities very well. In here, one aspect is that we are a supervisory technology team, which is part of the supervisory department. So we are sort of one foot in IT, one foot in business, or we sit in the business area. So we already have sort of created another moving part in this traditionally bilateral relationship between business who asks for things and IT who delivers. And as explained about the models, these they not only that we can't really trust their knowledge and reasoning, but they can be inconsistent in very surprising ways. And I guess the most dangerous case is when a person gets used to using GenAI based interface to the systems, and you can't help it. You start creating some sort of personality in your mind that this is how this guy works and thinks, based on your human abilities or intuition in telling where does someone come from. But you can never tell. It can work for in very expected way for months and months, but then all of a sudden the seventh of the models in that mixture of experts gets triggered for the first time, and who knows what the answer is. And we just need to put time and effort into continuous training of people to keep their thinking hat on and realize that you can never ever trust this as a human being. The starting point is that it's like working with a very junior analyst, but even a junior analyst is probably consistent, or at least our intuition that has evolved in over millions of years doesn't necessarily work in classifying the personalities of GenAI models the way it does work with human beings. So specific considerations, this also relates to what we said already. So we need to be careful to see where do we execute the models? Is it in the country or locally even, or can we use APIs and different regions? Which model or which models we use? My opinion here is that we probably want to source models from different vendors and provide users a mixture of these views, either so that we create that mixture, or we just provide them with multiple views. That there's, dear decision maker, here's your 3 different analysts have now given you their recommended actions for you, Mr. Meta, Mr. Google, and Mr. Azure. That could be one way of managing that risk. And then, like in any AI, explainability and trying to present to the user what led to this recommendation and how sensitive the result is to little changes in the parameters. We need to find ways of presenting these to the user easily so that they can further assess the trustworthiness of the recommendation at that point in time. And how can we really communicate clearly that the level of certainty in these results? And like I said, in everything we want to have human in the loop. This is not just about human in the loop. This is about that platform where the AI and the human staff members need to be learning together from each other on a continuous basis, so that anything AI says will be all the time validated by human beings, but then also human beings will learn from that collaborative input of other human beings, and the AI will learn from the collaborative input of everyone in the organization. The similar considerations really for RAG type of and agentic solutions. We just have to keep our heads cool. We have to be there. We have to monitor. We have to assess the results. We need to keep the thinking hat on, and we need to store everything so that we know we have that audit trail of how did we end up to some decision, but then also that we can use that audit trail for further training and fine-tuning over time. So that concludes my part. So I'm happy to continue the discussion, take questions afterwards, but also please get in touch if you are interested in any of these topics.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation, Perttu. So just a reminder for everybody, if you do have questions, please do submit them with the Q&A tab that you'll find on the right side of your screen. And we'll have a section for that at the very end of the webinar, where we'll address some of those live with our speakers. But our next section on the agenda is a demo from Tosin, who's going to show us a little bit about how some of these GenAI applications work out in practice at QFCRA. So, Lord Tosin.
Thanks, Corey. Thank you. Really great points brought up by Corey and Perttu. I just want to say very quickly, I think in general, probably we've been programmed by sci-fi. We think of AI as like, this all-knowing, all-powerful tool. And maybe in a few years it's going to get there, but right now it's not there. But something I do like to use it often for is for data cleaning. I think this is it's a low-hanging fruit, high-reward activity. So I'm going to show you a particular data cleaning use case that I use the Knime LLM nodes to do. So we have this massive report. Again, as a regulator, we oftentimes have to send reports to other agencies. And one of the places which, we have to submit is called CANAS. There's a lot of AML, CFT, so anti-money laundering statistics that we have to report. It's a massive project. And the challenge here is that we have a country list internally, but then CANAS has theirs, and it's a bit different. And there is no ISO 3 codes for us to, facilitate some reconciliation between their country list and our country list. So this is the allowable values from CANAS. It has the country names, but you can see here it doesn't have the ISO 3 alphanumeric code, for instance. So what really needs to happen here is they have to be reconciled for us to correctly populate over 32,000 data points. Now, initially, when I submitted this, I did not realize that there was this misalignment, and I got a massive document. There were over 100 pages, over 1,000 lines of errors because of this country name inconsistencies. So there's like 51 unique occurrences where the country names are not aligned, and this has to be addressed. Now, there are two ways to do this. Maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, somebody will have to manually go in and start Googling, the different country names and typing out the country code. So it can be done manually. And then from that point, lookup node can be used to make the replacements in the data in Knime. The second option is to use AI, to use those Knime LLM nodes to actually help us find those country codes for the CANAS list, and then we can integrate that with the rest of our data to make the replacements. So honestly, for me, there's two options, but for me, option 2 is much better. And the really cool thing is it's actually cheap. So I ran this like 5 times, and the cost for me was, it wasn't even up to, right, it was 2 cents. The cost was 2 cents. But just to point out, the Knime LLM notes, they actually have the ones by Hugging Face. So they have the free ones. They have GPT-4 I believe. So you don't even have to pay 2 cents. There are free options as well. And it reduces the room for human error because let's say I'm typing out these codes, I might fat finger something and suddenly I have a typo. And it's also a lot more fun to do this than to go to look up those country names and get those codes one by one. So this is just an overview of that workflow I have. Again, it's really big. I have to report over 3,000 unique statistics. So it's a monster. It's rather massive. But I have this prep here. So in here is where I do some of the data prepping. And then in here, I have that meta node that handles the ISO, the country name discrepancies. So I'll just share an overview, and then we're going to go over to Knime so you can see some more details. But I just want to show you this because it just shows how I'm able to integrate this. So after handling the country name issues, I'm able to just go on with the rest of my data pipeline and have that with the rest of the nodes and meta nodes, which help me compile those 3,000 different statistics. So this is an overview of the workflow, but let's go over to Knime to see some more details. Okay, so the starting point here, I have the CANAS country list over here. And over here, actually, let me zoom in. Okay. And then over here, I have the country list from our system. Okay, so the first thing I do is I need to set up my credentials to have the OpenAI key. And then here's where we connect to our Azure OpenAI. So I can't really show you this because it does have our URL, but I can show you this second node. So this second node is where I make the selection for the model. Just give it, okay, there we go. So I select the deployment name. So I'm using GPT-4 Turbo, and then I have to set the maximum response length. So I'm doing 4,000. And then the temperature, I have it set to 0 because for me, this is something, it's very factual. I don't really need creativity. So setting it to 0 gives you the most probabilistic outcomes. And of course, these models, they've been trained on a lot of data. So I would imagine they've seen a lot of these, country name variations. So I have those settings here. And then I do some data preparation. So the CANAS country list, I force sort it ascending. I don't think this is necessary, but I'll think it's probably easier for I would think it might be easier for the large language model to deal with sorted data. So I just sorted it. And then here I create a list of the countries, separating them by semicolons. So if you're using these nodes, you need to like have a table template that has a row and messages. So here I create the column for the row. And then here I rename my list of countries as messages. Okay, so I'm going to be feeding it these two. Now in the chat model prompter, I have a very specific prompt. So you'll find when working with these tools, the prompt is very important. It can really improve the performance of the results you get by a lot. So here I'm pretty much telling it, okay, you can't really see that. I'll just describe this to you. By the way, I'm happy to share this workflow. Of course, I'll take out my key, but you can always go in and see exactly what's happening. But I'm pretty much telling it that it's a detail-oriented assistant. It has high accuracy. I'm going to give it a list of countries. And I want it to reply me with those ISO3 alphanumeric country codes so I can use that to do the matches. And I'm telling it exactly how to reply to me so that I can parse things. So I'm telling it to reply me in the form of the country name and the column, the ISO code. For example, examples are very important. So I give it an example that, for example, you have country name Qatar, and then you have the code QAT. And I also let it know to separate each pair with a semicolon, and I don't want anything else in the response. And then I set that to let it know how to act. I'm passing the role, which is in my input columns, and also the messages. And once that's run, I get a list which has, so here I filter out the AI's response, but I get a list which has the country name and it has the ISO3 codes. Okay, so since I give it very specific instructions on how to structure this for me, it's very easy for me to parse. So first, I get a list. So first I parse by the semicolon so that I can put the different country names and the ISO codes into rows. So I get this as a list, and then once I ungroup it, we have our country names with the ISO3 codes. And then I do another cell split to split by the column. So I split that by the column. And now I have the country name and I have the code. And then from here, I'm just going to replace the firm's country list with the CANAS ones by joining them with the country code. So again, the initial issue was I couldn't do this reconciliation because the CANAS list was missing those codes, but now I have them using the GenAI. So I do that join, and I pretty much join them by the code, and I retrieve the CANAS country name. And then from this point, so we do have some instances where we have some countries which are not on CANAS. And in those cases, CANAS said to just label them as other. So I use the missing value to populate other when that happens. And then I have here my data that has to be replaced. So it's pretty much 33,000. I can't show you the full data set because of confidentiality, but this is the actual values that have to be replaced, just the list of country names. So I put them in here and I use the value lookup node to make my replacements. So here I'm telling it that from my input list, it needs to look up this against the country name, and it needs to replace it with the CANAS country name. So I think it's also important to append a column indicating whether or not a match was found, because this will tell me if it didn't find a match. So I select that, and then I could just use a row filter to look for those records where there is no match. So I go here, and you can actually see there's only one option true, but we can just type false just to be extra safe. Okay. And if we run this, we actually don't have any falses. So using the AI, it's been able to find all those ISO3 codes for me to make those replacements. And I submitted this, and we didn't have that country name error messages, which was really cool. But of course, it's still good to eyeball the results, which I did. So I did go through them just to eyeball them to make sure the AI did the matches and got the right codes. And in this case, it pretty much did do that. And that's the end of my use case demo.
All right, thank you, Tosin. It's always great to get a little bit of a Knime workflow at the end of a presentation like this, so we can kind of root all of the things that we're talking about really
Exactly.
insight specific.
Yeah, and honestly, I use these nodes a lot for cleaning. multiple times a week, and it really saves me a lot of time. So, and it's very cool because you can just integrate it with the rest of your data. So that's very, very helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think that what we'll move on to now is our final section of the webinar where we'll have some Q&As. So just again, if you haven't submitted questions, please do so in that Q&A tab on the right. And just to address one really quickly that always comes up, are the slides and recording going to be available? Yes, they will be. You will get a link at some point after the webinar where you'll be able to see the recording as well as access some of the slides here. So look forward to that. That should be coming to you in the future. And with that, I think we'll jump into some of our first questions. The first one that I have, it's kind of more of a talking point, really. So it's for you, Perttu, but I think we can all chime in a little bit, maybe. They say, thank you for the talks. We hear not to trust answers from AI systems, but humans make errors as well. So I would like to know your opinion on the question. Which answers of the same question would you trust more, the one of the AI system or the one of a human?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, this is very, very true. And I often actually say this when people say that AI systems are biased, but we all are biased, and that's why we ask follow-up questions. If someone comes to me with the analysis and says that Perttu, this is what's going to happen to economy next month, I will start digging into that, and I probably find something that sort of I get into the underlying assumptions. That why do they think that this is going to happen, and this can then lead all the way to their values and upbringing and things that are more emotional than factual. But this is the power of questioning, and the good thing about AI is that you can start questioning them as well, and you can ask the system to run different models and different scenarios, and you can then start to assess the consistency and the whether the diagnostics they offer to you, whether they are believable and consistent, and whether the outcomes they are suggesting are consistent when you alter the question a little bit. So a little bit different techniques probably, but then also a lot of it will be very similar. And most definitely, yes, we all are. None of us is perfect, and it's about, from our perspective, building those tools. It's about giving people those abilities to ask those follow-up questions and ensuring that they have the tools available to explain and to dig into the answers. So in that sense, I'm not worried. I'm not worried that this will derail us completely. But it is, like I said earlier, that there is something though, which is that we as human beings, we probably are consistent in certain way in our personality. And also, like I said, we have evolved, evolution has developed us this ability of classifying people or saying, okay, I can see where you come from. But there's no guarantees that an AI model will be consistent the same way, because they don't have a personality in that sense. And when they speak so fluently and so human-like, there is the risk that we start believing that they do.
That's a good comment. And I think if I can pull a reference from one of your slides, you talk about keeping a human in the loop. And I think that the real concern is when AI and human disagree. So it's always good to have multiple opinions on the same topic, even if they're both human opinions, just to check for consistency. Do you have any thoughts on that one, Tosin?
Honestly, my take on that question is, actually, it really depends on the question. So if it's a question of something that's factual, let's say who was the 32nd president of the US, I'm going to trust the AI, over a human. But if it's maybe a very specific niche question, maybe in regards to regulation, for instance, I'm going to trust our supervisors more. I'm going to trust Perttu more, people that work here more than the AI. So I think it depends a lot on the question.
That's a good point. I find that I see hallucinations a lot more often on very niche topics. Like if I really start diving into
Exactly. Yeah,
deeper
it's gonna mix
mathematical
stuff. It's
questions,
gonna mix stuff up for you.
yeah, and it's very
Yes.
Yeah.
convincing. So you have to be very careful. So good question,
Yeah.
good topic to talk
Exactly.
about.
That's the danger. That is the danger. Yeah.
So another question that we
But that was
have.
like a really cool
Oh, go ahead, Tosin. No.
sorry, I was just gonna say there was a really cool quote I saw. I think it's by Lex Friedman. I think his name is. So I think it said GPT is very convincing when it's wrong, and then somebody responded just like humans. So I can be saying something that's wrong, but I sound convincing, and it does the exact same thing. But I think again, people just give way too much credit and credibility to AI because we think of this all-knowing AI advanced bots.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true. I think it's a better liar than I am, though. At least I'm not always the most convincing.
probably. Yeah.
So another question, and this one was kind of answered in the chat because it was a little bit about how we can do RAG stuff or retrieval augmented generation. So maybe we'll put a little twist on that one and can ask you guys: are you doing anything with retrieval augmented generation? Do you have any use cases in that area that you're interested in working on?
Yeah, so that's what I went through the AML tool Tosin has been building, the rule book versus the policies, procedures. That is based on vector, a RAG, sort of standard RAG using vector databases and embeddings. But then also the MDM system we are building, which is then evolves essentially, will become our knowledge graph. Will then enable RAG in an exact sense. And at the moment there's a big buzz at the moment about knowledge graphs and RAG and sort of utilizing these both, because what the knowledge graph provides you is that exactness, and that you can traverse the knowledge graph in any direction, because the sort of linear PDF-based RAG chunks of text, it always requires that at least somewhat that someone had that sort of train of thought before. Whereas in the knowledge graph, you can jump back and forth and create different sort of kind of roots in the knowledge. But interestingly, also there's also quite blur line in between them. So some people are now then chunking PDFs and storing them as nodes in your knowledge graph. And so then instead of entity, ID, and name, there's actually a chunk of text. And then they are connected, that this follows this segment and follows this segment, but then you can connect it to the wider knowledge graph to say that this is the organization that published this document. And of course, you can then, if you have the time, you can go and extract entities further from those chunks and to say that, okay, the IMF as organization is mentioned in this chunk and that chunk and that chunk. So you can sort of, that line between vector-based RAG and knowledge graph RAG is actually quite blur, and this is very exciting area actually.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few LinkedIn arguments on this topic that you're kind of getting at, and usually they end with, you guys can do both, right? Like, and that's funny that you talk about it a little bit from that perspective too, is that you really can blend them. You don't have to just choose one or the other.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question that is for Tosin. A little bit about your prompt engineering. Can you elaborate on the prompt engineering that you were doing in your demo a little bit? Maybe in terms of where you started and how you got to what you felt was a good solution for engineering your prompt. Like how did you go about like finding the correct prompts?
Yeah, honestly, this one was pretty easier than most prompts because it's a pretty easy thing for it to do. But I just found that being as specific as possible is the best approach. Usually when you ask, the model something, it always replies back, "Oh, I have done this for you. Here it is," and it puts things in quotes and things like that. So I found that I had to go back and let it know only reply with this, because then I have to figure out how to parse out the rest of the response. So there was some back and forth and trial and error. But just some general guidelines. You want to be as specific as possible. If you don't want anything extra, you have to let it know. I even told it not to give me quote marks because it kept giving me quote marks. So be very specific. If you can give an example, that's helpful as well. And then just in general, for more complex, for instance, like the project I'm working on, the RAG one, in this scenario, I do encourage it to actually think and vet itself before it responds to me. And I found this helps reduce hallucination. So everything it does is always supported by evidence and page references, which it has to first vet before it replies to me. But some trial and error really helps a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting to ask it to vet itself in that way,
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
force it to be more
Think
consistent.
thoroughly before you reply. Yeah.
Yeah, think about it carefully, AI. That's great.
Exactly.
One thing that I've noticed just from my personal use with AI in this way is that even if you're sticking to the same model in an external setting, that they're not the same week after week. Like GPT 3.5, for example, definitely went through some changes in its lifespan. And one of the big ways that it changed was in like the scale of its output. Like it had this phase where it was giving really long-winded responses, and then they got shorter, and then they got longer again. Have you bumped into any issues with that when you're trying to do your prompt engineering to make sure you get the right shape out at the end? Or is that kind of addressed by
I mean,
asking
there
for
was there was a time, I think you guys probably heard about this, when GPT-4 was very lazy,
Yes.
You ask it for code to do something, it decides to cut something out and, end up fighting back and forth. But, one thing I realized, I feel like it responds to emotions. Like if my language is getting more frustrated, it like literally once I told him I'm very frustrated because I keep telling you keep like cutting stuff, and it gave me the full code. So yeah, prompting does help, but I do think it depends on the model version. Sometimes they do things, and even OpenAI, they did admit that it got lazy, especially with coding, and that's something that they did end up addressing and fixing.
So going back to the governance, I do think that in the end we will probably end up open source and locally running models once we get to that point, because now, as we see, the GPT-4 seems to be the standard, and everyone is converging to it. 1 year after, we're still not seeing any massively big differences in improvements. So we might end up with open source. We might end up with something that can run locally, and then we can have more control about this, because this is definitely a big risk in a setting that you don't exactly know what the model is that is behind that API.
Absolutely. Yeah, hosting things locally is a huge next step, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I've got one other question that maybe we can wrap up with, kind of open-ended here a little bit. What kind of future LLM use cases do you see coming to the finance space in the next few years? Anything bigger that you haven't really explored yet that you see on the horizon?
Well, I think in AI or GenAI, taking this GenAI, I think this whole sort of co-pilot, which is Microsoft trademark, sort of that going through, and I mean that any knowledge work, any production of drafting, analysis, and analyzing data becoming an interactive process where you can actually chat with the model that will then pull more other models into that and say, okay, here's the data. Okay, can you now predict this thing forward? And can you give me the Shapley values to explain what is driving it? And then you drafting that analysis together with that interface. So it's an LLM interface that can help you to get to the formulation in the analytical report, but then also pull the more robust AI insight from other models. And basically a Word or any text editor with the ability of pulling out charts by describing what you want to see and then saying what is wrong with them and so on. I think that's going to be massive in any field like this, where you analyze data and you report on the findings. No flicking between different screens and systems and copying and pasting and feeling lost, but rather letting your thought process to be in the center of everything.
Absolutely. I think that's a great spot for us to end, kind of summarizing what we see coming in the future. So perfectly timed, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been Tosin and Perttu from QFCRA. And thank you for joining us for this webinar on GenAI governance strategies.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.